Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something pretty interesting. It's a comparison, actually, that's made in the book of Hebrews
Yeah.
about Melchizedek and Jesus as high priest.
Yeah, and I think what we want to really dive into is why this comparison is so powerful and important, and what it reveals about this idea of a better agreement and a new way for humanity to access and connect with God. And we're going to be drawing this all straight from Hebrews.
Yeah, exactly. And, for our listeners, I think this is going to be really fascinating for you if you're interested in, how religious ideas have evolved over time, in the different ways that spiritual leadership is kind of presented. Or if you're just curious about the idea of like a deeper or more lasting relationship with God. This is going to be a great deep dive for you. So let's start with this really mysterious figure, Melchizedek. Who is he?
So we first meet Melchizedek in the Old Testament, and it's in the context of Abraham's victorious return from a battle, right? And he's described as a king of Salem and a priest of God Most High. And he comes out to meet Abraham and blesses him.
It's not just a casual, hey, how are you? Abraham, who's kind of a huge deal in this story, right? He actually gives Melchizedek a tenth of everything he's gotten. And that giving of a tithe kind of says a lot about how important Melchizedek is.
Absolutely. It really highlights the respect that Abraham has for Melchizedek. And this is where it gets, really interesting. The description of Melchizedek is really unusual. He's without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life.
Right.
It's not like anyone else that we really meet in Scripture.
No, it's so different, right? It's almost like he appears out of nowhere. And the
Yeah.
text goes on to say that he's made like the Son of God and he remains a priest forever.
Right. So this immediately sets him apart from like the regular priesthood that we're used to, where it's
Yeah.
all about who your father was and, how long you live.
Right.
So now we have this comparison to the Levitical priesthood, which is really important to understand here. Yeah, so I think the big difference is lineage. So the Levitical priests who come from Abraham through Levi, they were appointed by the law to receive tithes from their own people, also descendants of Abraham.
Right.
So it's like a family affair in a sense.
Well, yeah, like everybody's related. There's these established rules.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, they take tithes from their brethren. But Melchizedek, who doesn't have this clear lineage, receives tithes directly from Abraham, like you were saying. But maybe even more importantly, he blesses Abraham, the patriarch who had received God's promises.
Right. That's huge. Right. Because it's not just Abraham giving him something, he's getting something pretty amazing in return, right?
Yes. And the text says very clearly that the less is blessed by the greater, right? So this means that Melchizedek is superior to Abraham in this context, and then by extension, kind of hints at a superiority even over the Levitical priesthood that would come from Abraham's line later on.
Yeah. And it's not just about the tithes or the blessing either. There's this other interesting detail about their lifespan, right? The Levitical priests, we know, are mortal. When they die, their service is over. But Melchizedek is described as living, right? So that kind of points to this idea of priesthood that's much more enduring. It's not bound by time.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is this idea that Levi himself, the ancestor of the entire Levitical priesthood, is seen as having paid tithes to Melchizedek in Abraham.
Right.
Right, because Levi wasn't even born yet, but he was in the loins of Abraham. So this kind of implies that even the future Levitical priesthood was, in a sense, already kind of under Melchizedek.
Wow. So that kind of sets up this question, right? Okay, so what's this all pointing to with Jesus? Because if the Levitical priesthood, with all of its rules and all of its traditions, could have achieved this complete reconciliation with God, why do we need another priest? Like why this whole thing about the order of Melchizedek, it's almost like the text is saying, okay, there's something more here, there's something better.
That's right, yeah. And if you need a different kind of priest, one like Melchizedek, you need a change in the law that governs the priesthood.
Right.
The two go hand in hand.
They're totally connected.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so then we come to Jesus, and the text makes it clear that Jesus descended from Judah, not Levi.
Mm-hmm.
And it says very clearly, the law made no provision for a priest to come from Judah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, Jesus shouldn't even be a priest according to the old system.
Right. Like there's no way, based on how things were set up, that he would even qualify.
Exactly. But then you have this link between Jesus and Melchizedek, right?
Right.
And he becomes another priest, but not based on this, law based on the flesh, meaning lineage, physical qualifications tied to Levi. It's based on the power of an indestructible life. It's not limited by death.
That's powerful. And there's that declaration, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So it's like God is saying, look, I'm establishing something completely new here, something that goes beyond the old rules.
Yeah, exactly. And it's setting aside this previous law that
Wow.
while it was good, it ultimately was weak and useless. It did its job, but it couldn't bring about this complete and lasting reconciliation.
Right. And what takes its place is this better hope, right? And that's how we draw near to God. So this Melchizedek-like priesthood in Jesus, it's like it's a new door, a better way to connect with God. So let's talk about how Jesus' priesthood is actually better. What makes it stand out?
Okay. Well, one big thing is how Jesus' priesthood is established. Unlike the Levitical priests, who just kind of inherited their role, Jesus is appointed directly by God with an oath. The text says, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever." And so this makes his priesthood permanent and secure.
It's like unbreakable.
Yeah, and the text calls it a better covenant,
Yeah.
right? It's more solid because it's guaranteed by God himself. And then you have this contrast in the number of priests and their lifespan.
Right, because there were always new Levitical priests because, they'd die, and when they died, their service was over. But Jesus's life, it continues forever, right? It never ends. So his priesthood, it's singular, it's eternal.
And that makes it so much more effective,
Yeah.
right? And this allows him to do something the Levitical priests couldn't do, fully save those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. So it's like he's always there advocating for
It's
us.
constant. Yeah.
And then you have the way Jesus is described as a high priest, holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. So these qualifications, they're far beyond anything the Levitical priest could achieve, right? It shows his absolute perfection.
Right. And then I think the biggest difference is the sacrifice itself, right? The Levitical high priests, they had to go into that Holy of Holies every single year and offer sacrifices over and over, not just for the people's sins, but also for their own.
Right, because they weren't perfect themselves.
Yeah, exactly. But Jesus offered himself once for all. This one sacrifice, it's so powerful. It does away with the need for any other sacrifices for sin. That's huge.
It's like a complete shift in the whole system. And the text points out that the law appoints men who are, weak as high priests. They're limited, they die. But the oath after the law appoints a son who's been made perfect forever.
Right.
So it's like this ultimate perfection and sufficiency of Jesus as the high priest.
Yeah. So then we move into this idea of a new agreement in this heavenly sanctuary.
Okay, so we're introduced to Jesus not as serving in an earthly temple, but as a high priest seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. It's like his ministry goes beyond the physical world.
Right. He's serving in the true tabernacle, which the Lord set up, and not man.
Yeah.
So the earthly tabernacle is like a model, right? It's pointing towards this greater, more real sanctuary in heaven.
Exactly. And just like every high priest had to offer gifts and sacrifices, Jesus, in his role as high priest, also had something to offer. And that offering was himself.
Right. And the thing is, if Jesus were still on earth, he wouldn't even be a priest under the old system because those Levitical priests were already doing that job, right? They were already there in the earthly sanctuary.
And that earthly sanctuary was just, as the text says, a copy in shadow of the heavenly things. It was based on what God told Moses, right?
Yeah.
So Jesus is ministering in this real heavenly sanctuary.
And because he's in this higher realm, his priesthood establishes a better covenant, right? It's more effective agreement based on something much better.
Yeah. And the fact that we even need a second covenant, it kind of tells us that the first one, while it was good, it wasn't the best that God could offer. It had its limitations. And the text even says God found fault with the people. Like they couldn't keep up their end of the bargain.
Yeah, they weren't able to fully live it out. So what does this new covenant look like? Well, God says, I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. It's about this inner transformation, this deep connection with God's principles.
And there's going to be this true intimacy where God is their God and they are his people.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just following rules. It's about relationship.
It's personal. And there's going to be universal knowledge of God. Nobody will need to teach their neighbor saying, know the Lord, because they will all know him directly. And best of all, complete forgiveness of sins. I will remember their sins no more, God says.
It's amazing.
Right. And because there's this new covenant, the first one becomes obsolete. It's no longer needed.
Exactly. It's been replaced by something better.
So now let's talk about the role of blood and sacrifice in this new agreement.
So remember, the first covenant had all these rituals and a very specific physical structure, the tabernacle. And there was the holy place with the lampstand and the table with the bread, and then the Holy of Holies, that inner sanctuary.
Right, the most sacred space.
Yeah.
And in there was that golden altar of incense, the Ark of the Covenant, with the golden jar of manna, Aaron's staff that budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. And all under the shadow of the cherubim above the mercy seat. It's a lot, and we don't need to get into all the details now, but it's like all of these things were important in how people worshiped under that first covenant.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And access to that Holy of Holies was super restricted. Only the high priest could go in once a year, and he had to bring an offering of blood for his own sins and for the unintentional sins of the people.
Right. And that yearly ritual, it showed how people needed to be cleansed over and over again.
Yeah, and how limited their access to God was.
And the text says that the Holy Spirit is using this restricted access to show us that the way into the true holy place, which is heaven, wasn't fully open yet. So this old system, it was all just a shadow of something better to come.
Yeah, exactly. And the old system, with its animal sacrifices, it's described as a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. The offerings could cleanse outwardly, but they couldn't really make your conscience clean. And they mostly dealt with regulations for the body, stuff about food and drink and washings. And this was all temporary, just until the time of Reformation.
Right. And now we have Christ, who is the high priest of the good things that have come. He ministers in that greater and more perfect tent not made with human hands, and that is the heavenly sanctuary.
And he entered that heavenly sanctuary once for all, not with the blood of animals, but with his own blood. And through that, he secured eternal redemption.
So we've moved from this temporary covering for sin to a complete and permanent removal.
Right. And the text says, if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkled on those who were ceremonially unclean, could purify the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? It's about the power of his sacrifice.
It's a whole new level.
And so, through this sacrifice, Jesus becomes the mediator of a new covenant, a new agreement. And his death atones for the sins committed under that first covenant. So now, God's people can actually receive that promised eternal inheritance.
The text uses this really interesting analogy of a will, right? Like a will only becomes effective when the person who made it dies. In the same way, this new covenant only becomes fully active when Christ dies.
Right. It's like that death makes it all possible.
And the thing is, even that first covenant, it began with blood. Remember, Moses sprinkled the blood of the sacrifices on the book of the law and on all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you." And everything in the tabernacle was consecrated with blood.
So it establishes this principle. Almost everything is cleansed with blood, and without blood, there's no forgiveness. Blood was key, both in the old and the new system.
Right, but the difference is, the earthly things were purified with the blood of animals. But the heavenly things, they require a better sacrifice. They need Christ's blood.
Exactly. So Christ, he didn't go into a man-made sanctuary. He went into heaven itself to appear before God for us. And unlike those priests who had to offer sacrifices year after year, Christ's sacrifice was once and for all.
It was complete.
Yeah. The text says, if Christ had to offer himself again and again, he would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But he appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself.
And this once-for-all sacrifice, it lines up with the fact that we die once and then we face judgment. Just like we're destined to die once and after that to face judgment. So Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many. And he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him.
It's amazing.
Yeah. So to sum up our deep dive today, we've seen how Melchizedek's priesthood was so unique and eternal, and it foreshadowed Jesus's priesthood, which is even better. Jesus's authority doesn't come from, who his family was or from these old laws. It comes from this power of an indestructible life and this oath that God made.
Right. And we've seen that shift from the old covenant with its Levitical law and animal sacrifices to this new covenant that's based on Christ's perfect sacrifice and his work in the heavenly sanctuary.
Exactly. And for you listening, I think this gives us such an important perspective on what it means to be a priest, what sacrifice really is, and how we connect with God. It's about this more direct, this permanent, this personal relationship that Jesus makes possible.
Yes. And it's something that the old covenant just couldn't offer.
Right. It's something completely new. So here's a final thought for all of you. How does this idea of a better agreement, one based on this eternal priesthood and one perfect sacrifice, how does this impact how you understand your own connection to God, to truth? What does it mean to have a priesthood rooted in an endless life rather than, just who your family is or repeating the same rituals over and over? It's something to really think about. Thanks for joining us today on The Deep Dive.